All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Hometown History. I'm Jamie.
I'm Dami.
And tonight's episode is called Hanover Put Its Own Stamp Against Confederate Onslaught. This is episode 2.10. We are in our second season. We have more of our videos on YouTube, so go watch them. A little bit about me. I'm a high school history teacher full-time, and then for part-time work, Jim and I run a website called Witnessing York, and then I have a local history blog called Wandering in York County. My wonderful husband is here to help, and we are also expecting our first child in April.
Yeah. So are we.
No way! Congrats! Thank you.
Hello, and I am a Third Circuit Court of Appeals librarian for the Middle District of Pennsylvania during the day. In the evenings, I run a history site called Preserving the History of Newburytown, and I've been a Civil War reenactor since 2017.
Yay! I'm so glad you wear your stuff tonight.
Me too. It's nice and warm.
Tonight we are at the Hanover Area Arts Guild, and this is in partnership with York County Economic Alliance and their trail towns. So we had to drive pretty far. Dami and I are neighbors. We live in Newburytown.
Yeah.
Took us about 50 minutes to get down here, but Hanover is a very cool spot. If you haven't been down to visit in a while, they have a lot to offer. Luke and I were just here a couple weeks ago at the bar downtown. I was not drinking. I had lemonade, okay, but it looked very, very good.
Yeah, it's 2022. We're still not in the Civil War. So we're going to go over the agenda for tonight. So first, we're going to talk about the Battle of Hanover before, during, and after. And then we're going to talk about two different characters. A man named Old Uncle Sam, and then someone you might all know, Abe Lincoln.
Because I'm a teacher, we want to make sure that you leave tonight with 3 takeaways. There are 3 lessons. One is the Battle of Hanover was a first in many ways. It was the first Civil War cavalry battle on free soil. And it also, this was new to me, the bloodiest single event ever in York County history. Mm-hmm. Another one is that Hanover is a town of defenders. Yes. When the town was invaded, the people prepared food for the soldiers, the Union soldiers, and they didn't back down. And then finally, it left a big impact. Hanover, they prevented the General Lee from having his eyes and ears for the Battle of Gettysburg. So they left a big impact. So these signs, this is what it used to look like in Hanover. They have signs all over. Has anyone done the walking tour? You haven't? Okay, do you see that there are brochures on your seats? For those of you online, if you would like a pamphlet of the walking tour, you can find it at Explore York's kiosk, offices of Main Street Hanover on York Street, and then McAllister's on York. They just redid the sign. So this was the old, and then this is the new. These signs are gorgeous. They are full of information. Special shout out to Matt Jackson and Main Street Hanover for putting all the work into this. And if you want to see it online, Jim and I have it on our website called Witnessing York.
So we're going to take you back to Hanover during the time of the battle. So Hanover Commons reached its industrial peak in the late 19th century and into the 20th. The railroad and Hanover Depot opened in 1852. With it came industry. Some of the businesses were dye makers, feed mills, a distilling company, lumber and coal yards, foundry, water wheel manufacturing, cattle yard, hemp factory, firehouse, and the market house.
Everything, lots of jobs.
Yeah, very prosperous place to be. And the area has a long-standing history with hands-on and a self-reliant spirit.
This is all going to lead us up to the Civil War and the Battle of Hanover. Mm-hmm. So there were 343 casualties, and when I was in school, I used to think that casualties meant deaths. That's not the case. It means deaths, but then also people who are wounded or even missing. And like I said before, this was the worst carnage that ever happened in York County history on our soil. So the scene, it was June 30th, and the dreaded Confederate General Jeb Stuart came up. I'm gonna blame it on the pregnancy brain. It's the pregnancy brain. He came up into Hanover. We were outnumbered. They had 4,500 soldiers. Mm-hmm. We had 3,500 soldiers under Union General Kilpatrick's cavalry. When the Confederates first came, they went through the Forney's fields. So this was owned by Carl Forney, and the Confederates, when they charged along Frederick Street at first, they started ramming into the Union rear guard. And when they clashed, they reached the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment, and that is when the battle first started.
So the Confederates plunged into the column of Union soldiers, and soon the Union cavalry backed up, withdrawing north to the railroad tracks on present-day Broadway. And there the Union counterattacked. So Jamie is not very familiar with Civil War battles, and being a reenactor, I've had my fair share of Civil War battle reenactments. So if you want to picture what a battle's like, I can tell you about the Battle of Gettysburg reenactment that I go to every year. You know, you're lining up right across from each other, and you're marching toward each other, and you have these giant guns, you know, the rifle's about as big as I am, and you're just pointing it straight at the person right across from you. So you're hoping, obviously, to hit as many people as possible, and if you're a good shot, you can get off 3 shots a minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 20 seconds for you to reload.
Yeah, and it's like a 9 count that you go through, and they just drill it into your head and drill. So you're just going through the motions. You don't have to guess when you're out there on the field. So a really good soldier, it's just, you know, off the top of their head, they're just going. And if I don't hit you, I could hit the person behind you. I could hit the person next to you. The horses are running. The cannons are going off. It's pretty crazy. And the barrel of your gun's going to get really hot. Sometimes you can't even hold it, it's so hot anymore. And yeah, there's people falling all around you. The one time I took a hit at Gettysburg just because my gun was too hot and I couldn't hold it and I was running out of ammo. And I laid down and people were just like walking on top of me, pushing me out of the way. I've been picked up before and just moved by like the back of my jacket.
How did you know you were hit? They don't have like paintballs in their guns, right?
No, so sometimes you can draw like straws, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, we know this is how many casualties there were, so to make it look good, you guys have to lose like 50 people, you guys have to lose 25. And they'll say, you know, or, you know, if I'm standing right across from you and I like make eye contact,
you're like, I hate you.
Yeah, I'm gonna kill you today. So then you just take a hit. Or, you know, a lot of times you just run out of ammo. You know, you go into a battle thinking, you know, oh, I'm going to maybe take this many shots. And the scenario might last a little bit longer than you expected. That's happened to me a few times. So it's like, oh no, well, I'm out of bullets, you know, and I better die.
Did you ever have that one person that you're like, you're shot? Like,
all the time. The Confederates never die. It's so annoying. You know, I'll be making eye contact for 30 minutes straight, and I'm like, I killed you a few times now. Fall over. And they're just like, nope, didn't see anything. So obviously that's not like a real battle, but I mean the reenactments can get pretty realistic in that sense. I mean, when you get close enough to the cannons going off, and I mean with the gun smoke around you, yeah, it feels real after a while.
You might pull me in. That sounds interesting.
I enjoy it. That's why I'm in the uniform and not a dress.
So bringing us back to the Battle of Hanover, historian John Krebs said, because of the fluid nature of the battle, Union cohesion was lost as the fighting degenerated into a whirlwind of hand-to-hand melees in the streets, alleys, and surrounding fields. So it's just as you described, it becomes very chaotic.
Yep.
So new troops from the Union soldiers, they are going to tip the favor in the Union side. With the additional reinforcements, the Unions made another charge. This confused the Confederates. They head southwest to high ground, and then Hanover Center is once again under Union control. So it was close. The Confederates tried, but they didn't take it.
Thank goodness.
It was a success, so we're very thankful for that.
So 20 worn out Confederates are taken prisoner, and an unidentified Union private from Vermont had claimed to have captured Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Payne. Another Union private named Abram Folger of New York also claimed to have captured him. And he said, we captured one of their colonels in an old tan vat, into which his horse had fallen. His gray uniform with its velvet facing and white gauntlet gloves, his face and hair had all been completely stained. Not a good way to get captured.
Definitely not. So this all happened on one day. Do you remember the date by chance? June 30th, good job. So June 30th, do you remember the year?
1863.
Very good, 1863.
People are wearing those t-shirts.
So the skirmish didn't last too long. By 11 a.m., Stuart is on the run, and he is on the run with his mare named Virginia. What a nice name for a horse, Virginia. And he is going to splash away from the fighting across a tributary that is associated with Plum Creek. He is fleeing the Union soldiers. There are 25 to 30 behind him firing at him as he's running away. They're pushing against this rushing water. Now here in this picture, you can see that it's a small segment of the stream, but in some places it got up to 15 feet wide and 4 feet deep. If they could reach Stuart, then it was going to be a huge morale booster for them. So here's an actual picture of what one section of the stream looks like today. Of course, it's been 150 years, so it's been a long time. This is today where West Hanover Street Playground is. There is initiative led by Matt Jackson to try to change the name of the park to Union Park. Yeah. So here's some more pictures of the stream. And if we could catch him, I mean, you talk about what that would mean. A Confederate general captured by the Union soldiers.
I know, that'd be amazing.
Yeah.
But Stuart made it across the stream.
Yeah, did not work.
And onto a farm. And he regrouped with his men. And by the afternoon, he withdrew east of Hanover toward Jefferson and Seven Valleys, eventually making it to York, New Salem, and Dover. And the people of Hanover weren't rid of all the Confederate soldiers until almost dusk. But the next morning, July 1st, Stuart had been in contact with the commanding Confederate General, Robert E. Lee. Lee was about to run into the full force of the Union Army in Gettysburg. And that leads us to July 3rd, and these two cavalries met again in the fields of Gettysburg. Again, the Union troops were outnumbered as they took on Stuart.
So if you've been walking around the square, you notice that there is a very large bronze sculpture. And this is a sculpture called the Picket. It's life-size. It's a Union cavalryman on his horse. It's granite pedestal in the sculpture from Boston, Cyrus Dallin. And it's men like these, we want to point out, it's those average people who defended our town against the Confederates. They stopped Stuart from taking a direct path through Hanover and up through York. So I think that I love that there's a monument downtown to remind us of this and how important this area was. Now, I had a little bit of this content, if you haven't picked up, isn't my forte. I teach American history 1865 to current day, so it's right after the Civil War. So as I was doing this research, I'm like, the picket. What? So I was like, of course, Dami, what is a picket? Like, what is that job?
So when you're put on picket duty, you're keeping your camp safe. You're on the lookout for the enemy. So a lot of times when we're in Gettysburg, we'll camp at the Pennsylvania Monument, and we're with a surgeon's detail. So we're guarding the surgeon's camp.
So the sentry? Like a sentry?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Okay. It's a little different. So you could be on foot or you could be on your horse, and you basically just patrol for a set amount of time, maybe an hour, maybe a half an hour, and you just keep going back and forth. And if you see anything, you alert your higher ups.
Yeah. And another reason why we like this monument is because it's just an average person. It wasn't like we are showcasing the best of the best generals or the people who were like the most famous or well known. It's just a person, and that's a part of our common story that we want to highlight.
Yeah, a lot of the soldiers coming out of York County at the time were just farm boys. They were green soldiers, didn't have any military experience prior.
And that's what makes us wonder about civilians.
Right. So as we said earlier, the Battle of Hanover was the bloodiest single event to take place in York County. And you know, this is just, I don't know, it's hard to imagine because you think of like the Battle of Gettysburg, it's something we always talk about and how big that was. It was a 3-day battle in Gettysburg, but we kind of gloss over these battles that happened in York County and the impact that they had. So, I mean, I couldn't imagine if I was living in York County at the time and the battle came to my backyard.
Like your backyard.
Yeah.
Like you lived here and it happened right outside your window.
Right, and you'd see people that you know fighting for your freedom. So, I mean, it had to have a huge impact.
That's one thing my students always struggle with. They're like, where does the fighting take place? And I'm like, guys, it's not like they're like, hey, you guys, we're going to start fighting at 3 o'clock. See you there. Like, that's not how the fighting is. It's whenever there is one army that then meets another army, that's where the clash happens. And it was right here in Hanover.
Dumb questions that we get from tourists. So people will say, why was every battle fought on national park land? I can guarantee that the generals didn't get together and say, I'm going to meet you at a Gettysburg National Military Park.
Exactly.
You know, I'll hide behind that big statue, you hide behind that one. You know, so you found high ground, you found really opportune places. Obviously that would benefit you and your troops. So it was coordinated, don't get me wrong, but they weren't like calling ahead and saying, hey, like, meet you at noon.
Yeah, right.
So
So what were the townspeople doing then on June 30th, 1863? Well, when the Union soldiers were there in Hanover, there was a lot of hospitality before hostility. So General Kilpatrick arrived in Hanover and he halted right outside of Jacob Wirt's house. He was a community leader, and Jacob welcomed him into his house and he fed him, and General Kilpatrick used that time to look over maps, come up with a game plan, like looking at the topography and the rivers and where are they going to attack and how we can have the upper hand to win the attack back. Currently, it is where the theater is now, so to help place you at the theater in Hanover. So by 8 a.m., Kilpatrick went inside his house to review the information because the citizens knew that this was going to be a life or death moment.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, when the Confederates were going to come into your town, there's a very real possibility that death is near. And Union General George Custer ended up sleeping in the Wirt house on the same night, on June 30th, and then Kilpatrick went to sleep in the Central Hotel, which is right now standing at the northwest corner of the square.
Nice. And then the citizens of Hanover also fed the famished troops. Reverend William Saber, pastor of Emmanuel Reformed Church, encouraged all of the townspeople, the men, the women, and the children, to assemble food and drink for the hungry cavalry. They bought an assortment of bread, pretzels, pies, cakes, coffee, and even beer for the soldiers. So that had to boost morale. And then one dashing young lieutenant even bent down on one knee and kissed a woman's hand, and her name was Sally Weinbrenner, as a thank you for the big cake that she gave him. So she probably swooned. I can imagine her.
I'm thinking if Union soldiers went through my house right now, what would I have to give them?
You have a lot of canned food. You can a lot of things.
Yeah. Right now, though, because of pregnancy, food aversion is real. A lot of ramen noodles and apples. Yeah. Apples, right? One thing we like to do at Hometown History is talk about like quotes and primary documents and what people were thinking. So bear with me as I read Joanna Thomas's quote. She said, "The morning of the battle, I went to the square with a wash bucket of bread and a kettle of apple butter and helped feed the soldiers that were coming into Hanover. The soldiers were awful tired and hungry and were glad to get the food people were giving them. The square was full of townspeople with baskets of food. Then word came from General Stuart and his cavalry were coming. General Kilpatrick told us there was going to be fighting and we should all get off the street. I started to run home, but before I could get across the street, the rebel cavalry came along. The officer halted his men for a moment so we could get by. I ran and kept running until I got home. Just as I started through the door of my house, a bullet hit a rain spout, glanced off, and grazed my dress."
Thank God for hoop skirts.
Only you could turn that into something funny. Like, yes, I'm glad there are skirts, yes.
No, that would be terrifying, honestly. I mean, I couldn't imagine just being a civilian at that time and not having any way to protect yourself.
When it reminds us how comfortable we are today, that we don't have to worry about this.
Well, I'm thinking of the people of Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
The battle, that's a perfect example of the battles coming to their backyard.
Yep, exactly.
So, while the Union soldiers nourished themselves for the upcoming battle, the Confederates didn't waste any time. The artillery shell burst over the town, frightening the citizens. Major John Hammond rode to Center Square, telling them to take shelter in their basements. Reverend Saber heard Hammond. In a few minutes, there will be fighting on the streets. This was the last moment of peace before the storm of gunfire. For many, it was their last meal, their last act of kindness, and some of the men would ever enjoy. So their last moments on earth, unfortunately. Yeah.
So if you heard about this across the county, and you heard about the enemy and how it's getting closer to you, what infrastructure would you take out? What is something that you think, well, I'm going to destroy this because I want to make sure that it doesn't get into the wrong hands? Or if the enemy is coming towards me, what do I need to protect? Like, I know for me, my cat. I know that sounds so selfish.
That's your infrastructure?
Yes. I need to get my cat. I would also grab my passport and ID.
Yeah.
But like, okay, if you went then beyond, what is close to you that you're like, oh, I need to take this out? Would you have the courage to actually dig up your roads or knock down your telephone poles? I mean, that's your life.
Yeah, you have to think about it. You'd want to block bridges. You'd want to make sure that you're...
But you destroy the things that you build.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's going to keep my town from being invaded, though, I'd rather sacrifice a few things like that than the whole town to go to rebel hands.
And that's exactly what they did, because 3 days before, so going back before the Battle of Hanover, June 27th, there was actually another invasion that happened. So Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Elijah White, he came up with the Virginia Battalion of 260 men. And when he went through the York County area, he had a mission of destroying all the railroad bridges, just like you said, and then also telegraph lines as well. Yep. So this guy right here, here's our hero. His name was Daniel Trum. And Daniel Trum was a telegraph operator for the Hanover Railroad since 1860, so it had been 3 years. And his office is at the present day location of the Abraham Lincoln plaque. So if you've been to where that is, where the plaque is, that's where his office was. And he did not want to see all his hard work with the telegraph go just destroyed.
Yeah. Well, and it was so essential to people at the time too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read you a quote. He wrote to his boss, A.W. Eichelberger, president of the Hanover Branch Railroad. I saw about a dozen rebels after Abdul Git and another man who I did not recognize coming as hard as they could rid up the alley. The rebels were about 40 yards behind, and they shot at least a dozen times after them while going across the commons. As soon as I saw them coming, I pulled up my instruments and ran to the garret to the railroad warehouse and hid them under the floor. When Trone returned to town, he telegraphed news about the Battle of Gettysburg to major northern cities. These news agencies relied on Trone to tell the world what happened during those 3 days. So that just tells you, how important the telegraph system really was.
Yeah. But it also, though, shows you now how isolated everyone felt. Because this is before we had phones. This is before we had the internet.
Right.
All you had was a telegraph, and now the telegraph is gone. I mean, if you want to feel isolated, that's how the people felt. And you brought up Ukraine. Think about right now with the protesters in Iran, with the women who are protesting the morality police, the country shut down their internet. And so they had no way of protesting and getting their word out there. Yep. So the aftermath. This is what happened afterwards. So the evening of June 30th, the Battle of Hanover was over, but that does not mean the town was back to normal. In fact, it was far from going back to business as normal. So local physicians and Good Samaritans, they set out to work caring for the wounded, and this is where they took them. They went to the center square at the concert hall, and then later Marion Hall, which is present day on York Street, and this would have been a makeshift hospital for them.
A few days later, a makeshift hospital opened within the Pleasant Hill Hotel. 42 recovering soldiers were immediately admitted to the hospital, and after the Battle of Gettysburg, the U.S. government rented the building as an official Army hospital where about 150 men received long-term treatment. Trains carried up to 14,000 wounded through Hanover to Baltimore, York, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg, and a double dose of death from both battles.
Something you don't think about, like preparing for the battle, and then after the battle is over, you're like, all right, I'm done. No, you're not, because now there are people who are wounded laying in the street.
Right, and I mean, you have to think about the fact that they didn't even have hospitals like we do today. And today, the RSV outbreak right now, all of the hospitals are inundated with children. They say they don't have enough room in the hospitals. Can you imagine if you had 14,000 wounded soldiers show up at your hospital? We couldn't handle that today, let alone in the 1800s.
Right.
So,
yep. Now, the surgeon of the time, he was in charge, his name was Dr. Perrin Gardner. He said this about the hospital. He said, the hospital is supplied by the sympathetic people and administered to the suffering wounded by devoted women. A heartier response to the cause of humanity never came from a more generous people than you have witnessed here. So, go Hanover. Well done. Cared for your wounded.
while the doctors and the nurses aided the wounded, others cared for the corpses and the horse carcasses that lined the streets, because you have to remember it wasn't just human casualties at the end of this battle. The hot summer air meant decay and rot would set in fast. 39 men killed, number probably over 40, and some died after the battle from their injuries. Citizens carried Union bodies to a makeshift morgue in the nearby foundry, current-day Trinity United Church of Christ. And they were placed in the Reformed Cemetery, one of Hanover's oldest graveyards. The Union dead were reinterred at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, and the Confederates were then sent south.
That brings us to a picture of Tommy.
Wounded in battle.
Any guesses how many soldiers served in the Civil War that were from York County?
All of them.
No t-shirt for
Wrong.
you.
Lower. No.
Tell us, Jamie.
All right. The answer is more than 6,200. That's a lot of people. Yeah. More than 6,000 people, and 600 or more of them died from war wounds and then diseases.
Yeah.
All right, easier question. Do you know how many people died then in the Civil War? I see some Civil War experts out there.
Bueller. Anyone?
About 620,000 to 750,000 people died in the Civil War. Yeah, and why is this? Why did more people die in the Civil War, more Americans, than World War I and World War II?
All American
Infections and
Yeah, not only
disease and all that.
exactly, not only because we couldn't fight diseases, but also it was brothers killing brothers. It was Americans killing each other. Yeah, absolutely. So this is a cool picture. This is a one-of-a-kind photograph. There is no other photograph known of it. This is when they started the exhumation process to then remove people and put them in the National Park of Gettysburg. This is the only known photograph of when they did this. And how they dug up the bodies is they used metal sticks, hooks, and they reached down into the decaying bodies. Yeah, weeks, sometimes months after.
Which one's Basil Biggs?
Mush Matt was here. It's either this person, is he second from the right or left from the right? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I was going to include that, but
Basil Biggs.
Yeah,
You wanna
Basil.
keep it-
Yeah,
Basil
Basil Biggs. Yep. Yep.
Okay, so many people assume that because York County is above the Mason-Dixon line that no person was enslaved here, but unfortunately that would be wrong. So Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 was the first extensive piece of legislation to outlaw slavery, but it wasn't until the mid-1800s that the people were actually freed. Today we learned about the Battle of Hanover, and some of the fighting took place on Carl Forney's farms, as we stated earlier, and it was on that farm that the last formerly enslaved person in York County toiled away, and his name was Old Uncle Sam. Carl's father, Marks Forney, freed all of his family's slaves years earlier, and Old Uncle Sam moved into a small, rudimentary cabin near Mudtown, today known as Pennville, and he died in 1840. Today, the land has been developed into a strip mall.
Yeah.
Poor old Uncle Sam.
Yeah, Uncle Sam. It is interesting. There's a lot of firsts.
In York County.
And yeah, specifically Hanover. Yep. Yep. And one thing we want to highlight is how important Hanover was for the Underground Railroad. So as you know, before the Civil War, slavery was legal, and there were a lot of freedom seekers, people who did not want to be in that situation, so they ran away. You can see from this map down here that Hanover was a central location where people went, and then also through York. So the Underground Railroad was this secret network of people and their homes and their businesses, and it was their job to, in secrecy, help people who are trying to escape bondage. Right in Hanover, we have many conductors, a part of the Underground Railroad. For example, Jacob Britt, we talked about him before. He was the one who hosted General Kilpatrick, who welcomed him into his house. He was also part of the Underground Railroad. And so when people would come through, he would give them rest, food, shelter, assistance, and then hook them up with the next leg of their journey. There's also another man named Bill Piper. He was a fiddle player and also the grandson of a previously enslaved person. He provided safe passage for people when they went through, and he used his small cabin outside of the Westminster Road Commons. What's interesting about Bill Piper is a part of people didn't do the Underground Railroad for the accolades. Like you couldn't because no one knew what you were doing.
Right.
Every few months, his friends said that Bill would become a recluse and not talk to anyone. And they just thought he was being strange. Actually, that when he was conducting his Underground Railroad, that when he was helping people, because he didn't want people to come into his house. They would come knock on his door and say, no, can't come in, because he didn't want to risk anyone finding out what he had. At the time, the federal, let me make sure I have it right.
Federal Fugitive Slave Act.
Thank you very much. That made it a federal crime
Yeah.
to actually help freedom seekers. All right, we can't talk about Hanover and not talk about Abe Lincoln.
He was here. He really was here. I swear.
He did come right here, guys. Abraham Lincoln came through Hanover.
My main man, Abe. So less than 5 months after the Battle of Hanover, Abraham Lincoln's train briefly stopped in Hanover on November 18th. His train chugged, I can't talk tonight, I don't have pregnancy
I was
brain.
gonna say, maybe
No. Chugged down the main line at 5 p.m. To allow a freight train to pass, his train slowly rolled into an auxiliary line to make room. When the train began to move again, Lincoln ducked his 6'4" frame through the coach car's doorway and said, "I trust when the enemy was here, the citizens of Hanover were loyal to our country and the stars and stripes. If you are not all true patriots in support of the Union, you should be." He actually wasn't feeling well, and he was later diagnosed with smallpox on that trip. That's horrible. And his train then left for Gettysburg, where he delivered his immortal Gettysburg Address.
I like to picture him like rehearsing in his head what he was gonna say.
I know, and he's a tall guy to be ducking out the window like that.
Isn't the Gettysburg Address coming up? The anniversary?
Dedication Day and Remembrance Day in Gettysburg.
And when is that?
Saturday, the 19th.
And you'll be there, right?
I'll be there all day. Yeah. Very cold.
So, as we're nearing now the end of our presentation tonight, we're hoping that you walk away knowing 3 new things about the Battle of Hanover and Hanover's history. One is that it was the first Civil War cavalry battle to happen on free soil. It was also the single most bloodiest day in York County history. Second, Hanoverians? Hanoverites? Yeah, okay. They are defenders. When the Confederates came through, they did not give up their town. They fought against them. And the citizens, even though they were unprepared, they figured it out, and they built the makeshift hospitals, and they gave them food, and there was no begrudgment. People were just genuinely happy to help the Union with lots of loyalty. And then finally, the impact. Because General Jeb Stuart was not able to go through Hanover and go through York, and because he had to regroup and it took time, that left General Lee without his main eyes and ears for the Battle of Gettysburg, setting him at a disadvantage. So we're going to film our next episode in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about a cemetery called Project Penny Heaven. It's in North York, so that'll be in December. Stay tuned for that. And also we're going to have, don't forget, Andrew Smith is going to start here with an interview. But before we do that, we also wanted to close with a question for you guys. So normally we end and we're like, all right, what questions do you guys have? But instead we're going to flip it around and we're going to ask you a question. Okay, so here it is.
Sure. While many Hanover leaders were undaunted by Confederate cavalry riders in the Battle of Hanover, York's leaders would surrender in 1863. What does this say about the differences between the two areas?
So York, they gave up York. Do you guys know that story?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. That's actually a contentious topic. Like, we did not surrender. We did surrender. So York gave up.
Yeah.
Hanover didn't. Hanover fought back. So we always like to think about the symbolism and the significance. What does that say about Hanover?
Turn it around for a question back to you guys.
You can't do that.
Oh, I definitely can. So I think it leans into, were there any political differences between York County as a whole and Hanover in particular, especially with Hanover being so close to the Mason-Dixon line?
I don't think people voted for Lincoln, right? Jim is our amazing expert here.
In Hanover, they voted for Lincoln. The rest of York County, the majority of the rest of York County has voted for Lincoln's opponents.
Yep.
I think that might help answer it then.
Yeah, right? Yeah, political. That's interesting.
Or we have
When on June 30th, there were 3,500 Union troops. It wasn't the citizens of Hanover fighting back.
That's true.
necessarily. When Jubal Early came through York, there were no Union troops there to help the York people. I'm from York, so I'm going to stick with that. He threatened to burn the town to the ground.
That's a great point.
Unless he got what he asked for. They had no troops there to help him out.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
the one big thing that he asked for, and a lot of people don't realize, what do you think an officer bringing in troops who are tired and hungry, knowing they're gonna have to go to a bigger war in how many more days, what do you think the number one thing is that he wanted out of York, Pennsylvania?
Supplies.
Shoes. Shoes. There was a local artist, or a guest artist, came to York College, and they did a 3D, how many story high, cardboard presentation of the whole
When
the events.
When Jubal Early came, the
Yeah.
events, when Jubal Early marched
Yeah.
through York.
And I was involved in that, that's how I knew that it was the shoes, because it was shoes,
Yeah.
and they had a big shoe thing, and this is fascinating,
That is
absolutely
interesting.
fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, they wanted shoes.
Huh.
They didn't have, they were walking barefoot with bloody blistered, injured feet.
And even, I mean, Dami has really neat shoes on, and if you look
Bergens.
And if you look at the bottom, she's got this really cool metal heel that she said makes it easier for walking. And so the shoes probably weren't even that high quality that people were getting, so I'm sure they didn't even last super long.
No.
Yeah.
They're hideous.
And they don't
Interview her feet separate.
they don't
If your
feel
feet
too
could
good
talk.
after a long day either.
It was a big ouch.
Would it be against reenacting standards to put in soles in your shoes?
No, people do.
Okay.
Yeah, people do. I mean, we always say if they had it, they would have used it. Yeah, as long as you can't see it, it's okay.
You can't see it from the road.
Right. Yeah.
Great. Any other reflections on what the Battle of Hanover says about our community, about us?
I'll just go say, in York's case, one of the things that was different about that surrender was York's leaders went out and sought out the Confederates 10 miles, not far from here, in farmers, as opposed in Hanover, they kind of waited for the Confederates to come in and kind of passive-aggressively dealt with them. In York, we sought them out. Now, York did not have troops, in part because they sent them to Wrightsville. And they could have had troops there, but they decided to send them to Wrightsville. But it grows out of the fact that York was Democratic and anti-Lincoln, so they didn't have the, let's say, the political or the inner strength to oppose, as opposed to Hanover, where the people kind of stood in a square and took on the Confederates verbally.
And that's so poignant then that Abraham Lincoln, when he was in Hanover, leans out and talks about, you better be loyal and are you a
Right.
true patriot?
Yes.
Because he was amongst the most loyal York Countyans to him and his cause.
It does make it seem now like passive aggressive? Like, were you loyal? Yeah.
Well, I'm sure he also knew what enclaves of the state were voting for him as opposed to...
Right, yeah.
So.
Are there any other stories? Dami and I have been talking a lot at you. Do you have other things that you'd like to share that maybe if you were to create your own presentation tonight, what would you have included in the Battle of Hanover that we missed?
There's
'Cause I know we
t-shirts
didn't
up for grabs, people.
Yeah, I know we didn't cover it all, so we welcome your feedback. Really? A+? Really?
Is it a folk tale? I'm a native-born Hanoverian. And I got my start in '63 up in the square.
Wait, are you in one of the pictures, the reenactment?
I hope not.
Let's go back.
We evolved
There it
fairly
is.
quickly into being a little more accurate. But in the books that were written in the late '60s, like Encounter of Hanover and all that kind of stuff, they talk about the guys riding through the market house because they thought it was a bridge.
Oh, okay.
Jim, is that true?
That's true, yeah. It was in some of the battle accounts.
Right.
That the market house, just like in York, there was a market house in the middle of Hanover Square.
Yeah, right in the square.
And they ran across it, they ran right through it, right through the market house. Felt like they were the wooden planks of a bridge with the clack, clack, clack of the hoofs.
I think that speaks, the chaos, and you do infantry stuff with the 87th, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I learned early on, like late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
When you introduce horses and full-size artillery,
Oh, yeah.
it stops being playtime.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
And the chaos magnify that you're not in ranks.
Right.
You're sitting on a horse, and the horse is going, well, I've never been to Hanover, but I'd like to get a gunbuster.
You're right.
And they rode, we think, how insane is that they would ride through an obvious market house, but in the brush of combat. They had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how close, I mean, how common it was to deal with urban combat. I mean, Gettysburg mostly took place in where we consider Gettysburg to have taken place, but I mean, you're just thrown into, I mean, it's not like you receive training in urban combat from, you know, your superiors in the Union Army when you get enlisted. So it must have been insane.
Right.
To think that the Market House was a bridge, I mean, you're accounting for maybe the angle of the sun, for instance. I mean, there's so many factors that have been completely different and unknowable to the soldiers that were there at the time. What am I supposed to do to not get killed by, you know, these guys coming at me? I don't know if they're coming from this way or this way.
Right.
Entirely different from the specter of being on a field and having to deal with them.
You just said a great word. You were a spectacle at that point, because all the people in their houses, if they were looking down at you, I mean, what if you were to look up and see someone peek through out their curtain?
Oh yeah.
I mean, the emotion from that.
Yeah, everything you're dealing with so much more. I mean, it's a Confederate. I mean, God knows what you were feeling walking through town with what you had to deal with them.
Great. Any other stories or comments?
Do you think any of the difference in the battle strategies, and I'm guessing this, was York, even back then, was more big city than what Hanover was? And these people were looking around, again, having no time to think or really prepare for this, and all of a sudden it's like, if we surrender and you know, get back, you know, get out of this, they won't destroy this whole, I mean, and that was very important, you know, history-wise at one point, and I don't think it was a cowardly thing, or the fact that they didn't understand the importance, but they saw it from a different perspective, versus, this just isn't my backyard and I gotta protect, you know, my family and my land. It's like, this is the whole county, this is very important to the whole United States at that point. So, I don't want them to destroy it, let's back down and get them out of here. Not that they were dumping on Gettysburg, but seeing it from a city perspective versus farming perspective, if that's.
There's another case in Carlisle where the Stuart, after he was here, went up to Carlisle and kind of threatened to bombard the town. And the commanding general there said, he's not going to surrender. So I think that York could have said, been passive aggressive as well, but they chose not to. And I think it does grow out of their political worldview. In Hanover, no matter whether it's agriculture related, Hanover was a good-sized town, as was Carlisle. In both those cases, they said no. In York, they said, come on in. There's a distinct difference there. I think it grows out of their politics.
Do you think any of them wanting them in would be that they could get information from, as far as? I don't think it was.
They were trying to protect their factories and so on.
Yeah.
And but keep in mind that the big difference is that York went out and met them, and you know, they went out and sought out the enemy versus standing there and surrendering in the town square. I think there's all the difference in the world there.
Right.
And that separated York's surrender from surrenders elsewhere in the north and most places in the south. The idea of going out and seeking out the enemy.
How many people did that, Jim? How many?
I'm not aware of another town that did that.
I mean, how many actual men went out and greeted?
It was complicated, but 5 men went out at the end. The whole surrender was catalyzed by a rash guy by the name of A.B. Farker, who was trying to protect his factory. He went out, cut a preliminary deal, came back, and then they sent out another delegation to make it official. And so the Confederates came in the next day. So, but to your point, it was a relatively small group of non-elected men who gave up the town, non-elected.
Well, I'm sure without any authority, granted.
They had no authority, and they voted to surrender the town.
But they still though made it official though. So like afterwards, the townspeople, the elected officials still then backed up that decision.
Well, the townspeople backed it up because they supported, they brought the elected people back via the ballot. So the people in York supported the idea of surrendering the town. Because they weren't particularly in favor of Abraham Lincoln and all he represented, and those Confederates coming up in many ways were kinsmen. They were cousins and relatives, and they shared the same political philosophy, and they just the people in the York area and other places in York County, not just in York, they just couldn't see splitting the Union over slavery. It just didn't feel like it was worth splitting the Union over that. It was a disruption for the economics. It was a social disruption. It just didn't think it was worth fighting over. So we didn't have slaves here. You already said there was no slaves in York County, enslaved people. They are in the South. It wasn't our problem.
Right. And I don't think that sentiment was unique to York either. There were a lot of places who felt that way.
Mainly in border counties like York.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. In 5 minutes, we're going to have an interview with Andrew Smith. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.